The automobile is one of the most important inventions that revolutionized the modern world. In America, the rich history of car culture runs deep as technology continues to shape the future of the industry. Jason Stein,
former publisher of Automotive News,
is here to share the stories of people passionate about cars, from industry leaders and innovators to car-obsessed celebrities. Buckle up as Jason takes you inside the boardroom, onto the track, and around the bend on Cars and Culture on SiriusXM Business Radio.
Welcome into episode 137 of Cars and Culture on SiriusXM. Good to have you back listening with us again. I'm your host, Jason Stein. It's a wild, wonderful, wacky world, the electric vehicle world. Consumers justifiably seem a bit flummoxed by the topic. In many ways, there are as many questions as there are answers. EVs are coming. That fact is not disputed. Hundreds of them over the next few years. For to count up all the projects that are underway across mainstream America, the question is, does mainstream America care? Will they buy them, and will they work effectively enough despite the many doubts out there surrounding the transformation of the historic powertrain? Headlines around EVs seem to have just as much momentum as the energy used to power them. So many questions. What must a consumer do to determine if an EV is right for them? What should a consumer look for with an EV? What kind of range can they come to expect? What about charging? How easy is it to get a home charger? And can someone really plan to have a trip across the country and not take a month, as was the case for transatlantic ship crossings? Today on Cars and Culture, just a few weeks after the Consumer Electronics Show, we talk to an expert about what's to come or isn't to come in the EV space. John Voelcker has a long run on the topic and has spent many years reporting on the trend for Car and Driver and Forbes and many others. John edited Green Car Reports for 9 years, publishing more than 12,000 articles on hybrids, electric cars, and other low and zero emission vehicles and the energy ecosystem around them. John now covers advanced auto technologies and energy policy as a reporter and analyst for Car and Driver. His work has appeared in print, online, radio outlets that include Wired, Popular Science, Tech Review, and NPR's All Things Considered. He splits his time between the Catskill Mountains and New York City. Today, we take a spin with John on the EV buzz.
Hi, I'm John Voelcker, and this is Cars and Culture with Jason Stein.
You can't go anywhere in the automotive scene without either reading, seeing, talking about, thinking about what's going to happen with the changeover in the propulsion system, which is basically this revolution. It's all it is. And I am honored to have a man who is immersed in the subject at many, many different levels. What's funny is that he splits his time between the Catskill Mountains and New York City and still has hopes of one day becoming an international man of mystery. But he is John, and you're here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. This is nice.
Great to have you on the program. So you're sitting on an airplane with an 11-hour flight ahead of you, and you sit next to someone and they ask you what you do for a living. And you tell them, John, and then their questions begin.
Yep.
Let's start with it. Is the average consumer ready for EV ownership?
Not every average consumer. I mean, we have 300 million-ish vehicles in the US now and 1.2 billion on the planet. Not all of those people are ready for EVs, but more people are ready for them than I think they are, especially those people who live in their own homes and have dedicated off-street parking.
So what does the average consumer need to know about the state of EVs today? Walk us through that scenario.
For my 11-hour plane flight, the person next to me is strapped in, so I just pull up a 288 slide presentation, keep them in their place. But a couple of things you need to know. I think the first and most important thing for people who have little or no exposure is that they're real cars. Back in the day, there was a lot of discussion about glorified golf carts. The phrase smelly hippies occurred more than once, but those things are just not relevant anymore. Any EV you buy from a major manufacturer is going to do all the things a regular car does. It's just powered differently. But, you know, they have power accessories, And, you can get in and drive them. And except for them being quieter and generally quicker off the line than any non-electric vehicle of the same segment, they're pretty unnoticeable. Some of them look odd, but many of them don't anymore. Many of them look just like regular SUVs or sedans or pickup trucks or what have you. So the first thing is really they're regular cars. The second thing I think is that people need to know more about charging than they do. Think about what you charge in your life today, right? Your phone is the thing you charge most, but you can also carry it around. You plug it in generally next to your bed overnight, right? That's what you do. You do a version of that for the car, especially if you have your own parking space somewhere nearby, because 99.x% of all the car parking spaces in America are somewhere close to electric power. So it may not necessarily be the right kind of power, but it's a start. We have the start of an infrastructure. But the idea that I've found in talking to people over almost 15 years now is it's very hard to get people to think about plugging in and in effect fueling their car overnight because they don't have a gas pump in their garage. So when I say, well, you're done with the car for the day, when you close the driver's door, you just take down the cable, open the door, plug it in, walk away. And you get used to doing that. It becomes part of your habit, just like plugging in your phone did 10 or 15 years ago. And after a while, people who do this, who live with it, don't even think about it anymore. There's a separate issue we'll cover later about on-road charging for longer trips. But those people who can charge at home, usually overnight, or also at work, a lot of large office buildings now have charging stations for where their employees park. And that's sort of the one that no one talks about, but there's a lot more of it, especially in places like California, than people realize until they get to the workplace. But you fuel and charge your car differently, and that's, I think, one of the bigger educational issues.
So I should say, you've published more than 12,000 articles on hybrids and electric cars and other low or zero emission vehicles. And you edited Green Car Reports, right, for nearly a decade?
Yep.
What your first interaction with a hybrid or an electric vehicle, did you have to become convinced as well?
No, I think because I'm an engineer, at least nominally from college, it's probably better for the civilized world. I never actually engineered anything for anyone, but I rode in a Prius in about 2004, which was, I don't want to say primitive, but it operated very differently from a non-hybrid car. But it was interesting, and clearly it was the most technically advanced car around, which is why you saw Silicon Valley just stuffed with them, because they were the most technical car you could buy. I was lucky enough then to get my first ride in a Tesla. It was actually Roadster number 3 in September 2006. That didn't take any selling at all, because I had never driven a car or ridden in a car. I didn't actually get to drive it. That was powered solely by batteries. It was at 14%. And I only got one acceleration run, but that was enough to make me a convert in that, okay, this is real. This is a car that I can drive on the streets. The acceleration is staggering. And while it wasn't quiet because it was a convertible and it was built by the British, which means it creaked and rattled, it clearly showed what you could do with the powertrain. And that was what got me interested, not just in sort of the hybrid and fuel part, but electric drive.
So how far, when you think about that first interaction, how far are we from that today? We're light years, John.
Absolutely. I tend to talk about EV time. Things move really fast in EV time. The first EVs, not counting the Tesla Roadster, but the first EVs, the Nissan Leaf and the Chevy Volt, were sold in December 2010. So 10 years after that, I wrote a piece that sort of looked back at how far have we come. And at that point, we were cruising toward having electric pickup trucks with 300 miles of range, SUVs of all sizes. They weren't just small, sometimes odd-looking compact hatchbacks. which is not a form factor Americans tend to buy huge numbers of. They were all the cars that we buy in the market. Weren't all there, but they were all coming. And the whole range thing about an electric car, it was acknowledged even then that you had a minimum of 200 miles of range, and probably 300 miles was where people just stopped worrying about using that car in their day-to-day life.
There have been so many comparisons, John, through the years of horses and buggies and whip makers for horses and buggies, and us being at that inflection point of when the whip maker went away. Is that where we are today, or will we be there in the next 24 months?
In the next 24 months? God, no. This is a generational change. It will last beyond the end of my lifetime. I come from stubborn peasants, so I expect it to last a few decades more. But the best analogy I can think of is catalytic converters. Think about the mid-70s. The American makers invented the catalytic converter that took the bulk of the toxins out of exhaust, took out carbon monoxide, took out unburned hydrocarbons, took out nitrous oxides, right? And they've been successively refined over the years. It took 25 years before a catalyst was standard fitting on essentially any automobile manufactured anywhere on the globe. So that's a generational thing. And really, that's just one component. That's exhaust after treatment, as compared to different form of energy storage, different form of propulsion, entirely different materials, and the ability to redesign the package of your car to take advantage of how different the powertrain is and where it's located. So EV time moves really fast, but even if we have, I think we're at 3 or 5 million EVs on the roads of the world right now, that's going to be annual sales. Yeah, I'm going to have to go back. Scratch that part. But we will take generations to turn over the bulk of internal combustion engine vehicles on the planet. Some will go quicker. Things like family SUVs, I think 10 years from now, the bulk of families who buy a compact or mid-sized SUV, which is your family vehicle, 10 years from now, they'll have 300 plus miles of range. They'll be a lot cheaper than they are today. That's a no-brainer. Electric buses are a no-brainer already, as are electric delivery vans for FedEx, those guys. So there's a lot of categories that right now it makes total sense. But there are a lot of edge cases, and people are conservative when they buy cars. So the transition will continue growing. We're probably going to hit 10% sales of cars with plugs in 2023 in the US. And that number alone, absent the sort of wackadoodle futurists, is a remarkable achievement just 12 years after the first mass market electric car hit the market.
And what about some of the latest headlines when we think about what you've just been reading lately in the news, including nearly 4,000 dealerships calling on President Biden to reconsider where the electric vehicle market is, and arguing that a mandate is an unrealistic shift to be EVs in the U.S. What do you say to that?
So many thoughts.
Let's begin.
Yeah. Number one, the auto industry and its valued partners, the franchised, independently owned third-party dealerships, have fought absolutely every government attempt to regulate their products, their business practices, or anything else they do for 75 years. It is baked into their DNA.
Right.
Anybody proposes any kind of regulation or change, they're against it. So I'm not terribly surprised. The letter was actually a little more modest than I had expected, because I think the entire industry really does realize the EV transition globally is now unstoppable. It will happen at different rates in different places. But I actually have a piece in preparation for Car and Driver, watch for it in the next 10 days, that talks about how a lot of these headlines about how EV sales are plummeting or dealers are bailing or won't do it or whatever are simply not actually backed up by the sales data. We now have pretty complete November sales data, and people are continuing to buy electric cars. The mixes among different makers shift as some of them have inventory and some of them don't. you really have to look at it as Tesla and then everybody else bucketed together. But the data do not support this idea that EV sales are tanking. And I'll have that data. But what is happening, I think, we went from 0% effective interest to what's it cost of business now? 4%, 5% if you're triple prime to borrow money. The Fords and GMs and everybody else of the world, the ones for whom we have most visibility into what their balance sheets look like, those guys are looking, hey, can we delay a battery plant even a year? Because that'll prevent that cash expenditure and perhaps interest rates will go down. Cash management's a little different now. But certainly, Tesla is still the big dog, pretty much 50% of all the EVs in the US, still shocking to people in places like Detroit. But other makers, I focus particularly on the Koreans. Hyundai and Kia are going full steam ahead. They will be building EVs in the US within a year. They have very aggressive plans. And of course, looming in the background are the Chinese makes.
What about the notion? Yeah, and I want to get to the Chinese here shortly, but what about the notion that dealerships want the administration to allow time for battery technology to improve? So there's issues of reliability and also affordability, John.
Battery reliability is not evenly distributed across different makers. So I would argue those are questions for different automakers individually as opposed to the industry at large. But I think battery reliability is really sort of a camouflage, if you will. Dealers fundamentally don't like EVs because they take more explanation. I've heard this argument that, they're looking at less service revenue down the road because pure EVs need very little servicing. I don't really believe that's a factor. Most of the dealers I've talked to are focused on today's sales, this week's sales, this month's, this quarter's, this year's. They're not looking at 10, 15, 20 years down the road. What I do see, though, is that dealers don't like having to answer questions over and over again, train salespeople who have high turnover in some of the less good dealerships. It's just more time that they ought to be spending getting someone to sign for the car whose payments they can afford, that they already know exactly how it works. I tend to think with the Biden administration goals, we may not hit their goals, but you need goals to shoot for. Having goals is a good thing because otherwise it's diffuse. The reasons for adopting electric vehicles are very clear. The climate impact numbers are now beyond any form of doubt, despite what the Wall Street Journal occasionally tells you. And overall, I view this as essentially the give and take that happens in any major transition, because large portions of society are scared by transition. They're scared by change. They know they don't know about something. And there's an inherent reaction, especially because our car is the second most expensive thing we buy after our house, right? So most car buyers, not the tech forward ones, but most car buyers are sort of content to say, you know what? I'm going to let my neighbor or my coworker or my relation or my friend pioneer. I'll see how it goes with them. And maybe we'll think about an EV for the next round. But they're now in discussion, and increasingly those friends and neighbors and coworkers do have EVs, and they're starting to answer questions about them. There are some bad experiences, just like there are bad experiences with certain brands of cars or certain models of cars. But overall, they are becoming a more familiar part of the car buying pool. There's a name for it, not potential, but consideration set. They're becoming part of the wider consideration set. And that's a process that takes years.
So let's get into the environmental piece of it. Considering how it is that we make energy here in the US, coal, water, wind, solar, are EVs truly a green alternative?
EVs are absolutely and unquestionably greener in terms of lifetime CO2 per mile. And I can do this at length, which I will spare you, but there's 3 points I want to make. Number one, people talk a lot about coal. Coal is massively uneconomic, and certain coal producing states are having to pass legislation mandating that their utilities not shut down they're much higher cost coal plants. Okay. They got to keep them using them, even knowing the environmental impact, simply because a kilowatt hour produced off burning coal has about twice as much carbon as a kilowatt hour produced in a modern combined cycle natural gas plant. I'll stop with the utility analysis there. But number one, coal is now below 20% of the US power mix, which is half what it was 20 years ago, and it will continue to fall. More than that, the bulk of new generating capacity added in the US is renewable. And you really don't want to be the CEO of your local utility who has to decide, how do I spend $500 million to build a new generating plant? Do I simply lease 5,000 acres of empty land and cover it with cheap solar panels on racks? Or do I actually contract with a GE or someone to build that extremely complex, high maintenance, very carefully adjusted natural gas generation plant? The answers aren't clear right now, but the curve is moving decisively toward renewable energy. So number one, coal is plummeting. Number two, renewable energy is the bulk of our new grid mix, and the grid is getting cleaner, which leads me to number three. An electric car you buy today, let's say you own it for its 12-year lifespan, will be considerably cleaner in 12 years because the grids you charge it on are decarbonizing all over the world, basically, including in the States. So there will be less carbon for every mile you drive in your used EV in 12 years than there is today. But already today, the dirtiest grid in the US, when you do the numbers properly, the CO2 burden of an electric vehicle, which is really what is driving a lot of this. We'll get to their better cars later. But the CO2 burden of an EV per mile is now the equivalent of a 40 mile per gallon car. And they just don't sell a lot of those these days. That's on the dirtiest grid. On the cleanest grid, I happen to live on one purely by accident. We're at about 100 miles a gallon, and no one has ever made a gasoline car or will make a gasoline car that does 100 miles a gallon. So EVs are so decisively cleaner. That's not in debate anymore.
Okay. It's the best explanation I've heard of it, actually. Let's talk. So infrastructure. Why are we so slow to invest in infrastructure? And would it be to the oil companies' benefit to put a fast charger in with their gas pumps?
We tend to be slow to invest in almost anything these days. I will avoid all the political implications because that gets political real quick. But building stuff is not a skill the US has maintained to the degree we used to. That also means you're not likely to get an interstate ran through your neighborhood. But building stuff is hard in the States. More than that, we are averse as a nation to centralized planning. Remember, we have 50 different states, or 50 countries, as I like to tell my European friends, held together by the framework of being a nation. And so each state makes its own rules. The money that the Biden administration has set aside to build EV charging is administered through the states, each of which sets its own rules. Tell a European that, because they're used to central planning. They have the idea, okay, I want to be able to drive from Norway to Portugal in an electric car. What do we need to do across 5, 6 national borders to make that happen? We plan. We figure out, where should they go? All right, Spain, yours are here. Norway, yours are here. That kind of thing. A lot of it's done at the country level, but they do actually coordinate. We don't do that so much. And the other thing is that the bulk of the charging offered today, netting out Tesla. Tesla is its own topic, but everybody else, there are small venture or private equity funded companies setting up charging networks. None of them is making money. So there is no incentive to keep the chargers actually up and running. They are engaged in a land grab in the very early stages of putting together their businesses so that when their company is rolled up into something bigger, they can say, we have this many locations, whether or not the damn things actually work. Tesla, because they control not only the car, but they installed their entire charging network just for their owners for 10 years. They built the hardware themselves and they control the software on both ends of it. Tesla has an ultra reliable network in the US. It is the gold standard, and still no one else has come close, which is why the Fords, GMs, and others of the world finally threw in the towel and said, screw you to all these small, private, unreliable networks. We're going to go with those guys.
Right. Yeah, those are the agreements. Let's explain that. Well, let me get the second part of that question that I asked you. Would it be to the oil company's benefit to put a fast charger in with gas pumps?
Yes, although remember that a lot of gasoline distribution isn't done by oil companies. They sell gasoline to third parties who sell it to retailers. What I tend to term it as is the convenience store industry. And those are big, professionally run industries. They make some money selling a gallon of gasoline. They make way more money selling you salty snack foods, sugary sodas, beer, cigarettes, and lottery tickets. And think about the version of that where instead of being at the gas station for 9 minutes, you're at the location for 25 minutes. How much more money can they squeeze out of your wallet? C-store operators see this, they get it, and they're starting to grapple with, okay, we got to talk to the utility now about bringing in real sort of high voltage power. What the hell is that about? So it's a process, but truck stop chains, convenience store chains, those are the places that have the amenities that will make people more comfortable going to charge EVs. Because quite frankly, your Mercedes-Benz EV driver does not want to sit in a badly lit Walmart parking lot in the center of the lot at midnight.
Well, and they also probably don't want to sit for 20 minutes. So let's talk about charging time and charging solutions. Mm-hmm. Explain to our listener, what is a rapid charger? What is the Tesla charger? And what are the differences? You alluded to it a second ago, but let's dig deeper into that.
Sure. Charging in the broad plan, I'm going to break into two buckets. There's slow charging. That's hours. That's what you do overnight. Okay. Usually on a 240 volt circuit like your dryer, your electric clothes dryer uses. But then there's fast charging, which is really for on the road when you're going to visit grandma and her house exceeds the range of your car. So somewhere in the middle of the trip, you will pull into a travel plaza or just off the interstate and you go to what's called a fast charger. Now, there are different rates of charging and different EVs charge at different rates. I'm not going to break them all down here. Tesla has the advantage that it has constantly been boosting the rate at which its electric cars can charge. They're about to launch the 4th generation of their supercharger network. And there is mostly backward compatibility, asterisk that. But overall, the idea is that you will charge from wherever your car gets to. And we have this thing called battery charge. It's a percentage, right? It's okay to drive your electric car down to 15% of your battery if you know you have a fast charger 4 miles away and you know it works, which is the key part. And you just drive in you charge from 15% to 80%. And that takes anywhere, depending on the car, and depending on the particular charger and how many other cars are charging there and so forth, that takes between 18 and 40 minutes, depending on how big the battery is and everything else. So what I've found is 25 minutes sounds, and that was actually the average stop. There was some new data that came out today. 25 minutes sounds like a really long time to people. And granted, it's probably 15 minutes longer than you spend at the gas station. Even after you go inside to use the facilities and buy the salty snack foods, you can still be in and out in 10 minutes usually. But what people end up doing is the same thing. Maybe they'll buy a coffee drink instead of a soda, and then they come back to their car and they spend the additional 12 minutes on their phones. It's what we all do. If you're in your car and you can't move, whether it's a traffic jam or whatever, you're going to look at your phone, and that's exactly what people prove to do.
So how about, you mentioned it earlier, the agreements between GM and Ford and getting on to the Tesla charging network. Do you see that as the next viable alternative? Will more automakers go that route?
Maybe and yes. This is a very interesting time in charging. The only reason that Jim Farley at Ford went to Tesla and said, we want to use your network. What does it take to make this happen? Is the extreme fury among automakers, not just the Americans, but the Europeans and the Asian makers, at the unreliability, and more than that, the not caring about unreliability problem among all of those individual networks. Tesla cares, they keep their network up and running. The one thing that we will be watching next year is, as you start to get Ford's charging at Tesla superchargers, along with other makes, does the software connection work as seamlessly as it does with Tesla? Because again, remember, Tesla designs both sides of a Tesla charging at a Tesla station, right? Ford is not going to let Tesla look at every single detail of its vehicle code. There is third-party validation with a credit card to be done. There's a lot going on. So I think the promise of Tesla charging other people's cars is high. And certainly they have a reputation for reliable networks, but it's all going to be in the implementation. But then there's the issue that the other automakers don't particularly want Tesla to be the largest and most reliable provider of energy to their electric cars, which is why 7 automakers got together and announced they're going to build their own supercharger-like network. And it will have, in many cases, the amenities. They actually talked about airline lounge amenities that will make people want to go there as opposed to alternatives. That said, they announced it several months ago. We have yet to see any executive name. We don't even know what the thing is called. But if that comes together, and there are questions about whether they can play together and how fast they can make it all happen, that will be one alternative to the Tesla supercharger network. And then another one will be some of these very large convenience store chains.
Let's think about where this all goes, John.
Sure.
If the greatest advances will come out of battery technology and or charging, or both, what could this world look like within a few years? Will we be reducing our charging time down to the gasoline station fill-up? And do we just kind of get past this whole idea?
I have never tended to believe that 1 or 5 more minutes than a gas station fill up on a very long trip is the only metric that will allow people to adopt. There is some middle ground. Clearly 40 minutes stop, where 10 minutes at a gas station, that's probably too much. On the other hand, everybody I know who travels with their family, they end up spending 15 or 20 minutes at the gas stop by the time all the kids have gone to the bathroom and so forth. So there's some kind of intermediate level. Battery advances, we know historically, batteries improve in cost performance at 8% a year. So it doesn't sound like much. It's not Moore's law, doubling every 18 months, but it's a lot quicker than gasoline engines improve in efficiency. So we can say, okay, by 2030, batteries will be almost double the energy density they are today. Where does that take us? Lighter EVs or more energy within the same form factor? And there will be a variety of things along that. But I think as I see the world 10, 15 years from now, owning an electric car won't really be the, wait, you own what? Oh, what's that like? Kind of thing it is today. 10 years ago, it was wacky. You know, someone owned a Ferrari, they owned an electric car. Now it's, oh, yeah, I heard there are electric cars, but I don't know if they're going to work for me. How does it work for you? And that's a 10-year process. Meanwhile, electric cars are going to get cheaper. They're going to enter more and more of the segments. We've already got pickup trucks, and we'll have big SUVs and all the rest. And I think increasingly they will spread. Remember, people only replace a car every 5-something years. I forget the number, but you know, it's not something that you're going to suddenly wake up and decide you're going to buy an EV. You're going to run the current car till it gets too expensive. Then you might consider an EV. And the chance that you will get an EV is a little higher every year in the future. And then at some point, it just stops being remarkable, absent people in very sparsely populated states who have to drive 70 miles to Walmart. But that said, there are not that many of those people compared to the suburban lives that the bulk of Americans now live.
Yeah, that's always the example, John, that's talked about is, well, what about in the middle of Texas? And what about in North Dakota? And, well, I'm in Florida and there's a hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'm in California and Colorado, and the governors have told me to shut off my AC unit, which also means I don't charge my car. Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of different sort of national themes that exist around EVs. How do you address each one of those?
I look at each one on the merits. So it's worth noting that if you have a hurricane in Florida, you can't get gas either, because if your power goes out, you can't pump the gas out of the tanks. Everybody tends to forget that. I think home storage batteries will become more common as more and more people go to all electric heating and cooling. And the idea, Ford was shocked how much people cottoned onto this idea that your electric F-150 could actually power your home for a couple days. If you have the right wiring, a lot of asterisks on that one, but essentially the idea is, oh, wait, so the truck can be my Honda generator, but I don't have to have it in a place where I can vent it and it's not running an engine constantly. And really, 2 or 3 days. Okay. So there will be home energy storage to let you recharge your EV in that case. Looking at the governors of Colorado and California, they're asking you to turn off your AC at peak power load. They're not asking you to turn off your AC at 2 a.m. And all electric utilities very much want you to charge your EV, if at all possible, between 11 at night and 6 a.m, which is their demand trough. They actually love the idea of EVs charged then because their equipment works more steadily. I've talked to a lot of electric utility executives over my so-called career. The old, scarred ones, mostly retired now, will say, by and large, they're not worried about EVs compared to what they lived through when incredibly cheap, really inefficient window and central home air conditioning arrived in the 60s and 70s. They said that put far more stress on our grids than we ever expect EVs to, because that was all peak demand. We're just going to push EVs to be charged in the demand trough.
A couple final things in the remaining minutes that we have here. What's the next wave of EV expense that we have to consider and must concern ourselves with? Is it safety? Is it renewal and recyclability? Is it storage?
Next wave of EV, you mean for an EV owner? What are the anticipated costs? Yeah. We're still in the early stages of gathering battery life data. Thus far, what very little data we have on EV batteries 7 years old or more, and there just weren't that many EVs sold for the first 5 years, seems to be cautiously optimistic. EV batteries do actually last the life of the car. There will be some degradation, but nothing like your phone. And the life of the car is sort of 12 to 15 years. So the idea that you will have to replace the battery after X years just isn't borne out. There may be recalls. It's the management of that recall process as opposed to the actual cost of it, because by and large, if something goes radically wrong with your battery and you're in warranty, the manufacturer has to pay for it. I'm not seeing a lot of them, frankly. It's going to be a change in how we fuel cars. I think the biggest expense is going to be, what do we do with those Americans, half of us say, who live in multiple unit dwellings, who don't have assigned parking spaces, who hunt for a space in a big open lot, and if they're rentals, whose landlord is not interested in adding the cost and complexity of EV chargers, even if there might be a couple 120-volt sockets to plug in the electric hedge trimmers or something. That's a tough problem. And what it may end up with is that the higher income chunk of the market has a much higher EV penetration way before the lower income part of the market.
Yeah, because we didn't even talk about those multi-unit dwellings, did we? I mean, it's a concern right now. If you live in a condo and there's no infrastructure because the HOA has decided, the board hasn't decided to invest in the condo that you live in, you're out of luck, right?
Yeah. Tesla owners who buy $100,000 Teslas often have an ability to suggest to their HOAs or their landlords, we think it would be really nice if you put in charging stations. And to be fair, a lot of municipalities now are requiring new dwellings to be pre-wired for charging stations. But it's a non-trivial problem, and I think it will be slow and lumpy, especially, again, for working people, many of whom put more miles on their cars to get to jobs that are further away because of where they can afford to live.
Car and Driver likes to talk about really cool, sexy vehicles. Over my right shoulder is actually an issue of Car and Driver that you might see, which highlighted this show in its page, which I'm deeply appreciative of. Why do designers like creating EVs? Why do EVs have to look like science projects? Or maybe they won't be anymore.
Second question first. I don't think EVs have to look like science projects. In fact, if you look at a lot of the EVs that are coming out for 2024, they're, big, square, aggressive-looking SUVs, just like the big, square, aggressive-looking SUVs that are powered by gasoline engines. But designers like EVs because the powertrain is arranged differently. Basically, you have a big flat battery between the axles, wall to wall, axle to axle, and then really small electric motors and electronics between each set of wheels. You don't have this big 1,000-pound lump of metal, engine and transmission, sitting up front where they have to provide really complex crash structures to keep that engine away from your kneecaps, right? So what it allows them to do is play with the shape of the vehicle. And the most reductionist way to say it is you can have a vehicle that's the same length as something with an engine. The wheelbase is longer, so you get a better ride, but you get shorter front and rear overhangs and a longer cabin. And actually, there are two examples of that. One is the Jaguar I-Pace, which is nominally a small SUV, and the other one is the Tesla Model 3. If you actually look at a Model 3, it has a remarkably short nose and a low cowl, which means frontal visibility is superb. That said, a lot of Americans want to buy big honking trucks, and the big honking trucks that happen to be EVs will have the same big square fronts, even though there's mostly air underneath.
If I'm a consumer who is starting out on an EV purchase path decision, what are the 5 or 10 questions that they should ask and answer sufficiently to make an informed decision?
If they're looking at a Tesla, where's my nearest Tesla service station? If they're looking at a non-Tesla, when I go to the dealership for the brand that I'm thinking about, do they have an EV specialist? Or is it sort of, oh yeah, Jimmy can answer that? Is there some man or woman who is just the EV specialist who can answer in an informed way, knowing local incentives from utilities and all the rest, how you really use an EV, how you charge an EV at home, all of that. If your dealership, if you walk in and say, I want to look solely at an EV, and your dealership says, all right, well, Janine is the next one up. You get Janine, walk out. At this point, there is no excuse for dealerships not having dedicated EV people unless they can claim that every single salesperson is sufficiently versed in EVs, local conditions, utility relationships, and all the rest. And frankly, I don't believe that for most franchise dealers today.
Final thing, John, do you own an EV?
No, because I live outside Woodstock, New York, I drive a good 23-year-old, 150,000-mile Subaru Outback, just like all my neighbors. I own 6 gasoline-burning old cars. We are probably, when the Subi dies, we are probably going to get an EV. We just can't quite agree on which one, but that's an internal discussion. But yeah, I'm there. I've had a charging station since 2015. I'm actually on my second charging station now. The first one broke. And I test pretty much every EV that's on the market. So I drive a lot of EVs, even though I don't own one today.
So considering the vast numbers of EVs that you have driven, give us your choices for each category. Let's go small commuter car first.
small commuter car, well, small, medium, you get sort of fuzzy. Is it really an SUV? They say it's a utility. They're not calling it an SUV, but on the small car end of things, I'm quite fond of the Hyundai Ioniq 5, in part because it reminds me of the first Volkswagen Golf / Rabbit. Handsome car, works well, good package for us. You can get all-wheel drive, which we need because of my driveway in the winter. But that's one choice. Pretty much, I'm impressed overall with the Hyundai Kia lineup. Next category.
Sedan.
It's really a toss-up here because, I like the Model S. It's a really big car to drive. Used Model S's might be a value, but for a new one, Tesla Model 3, and the only other sedan really out there is the Hyundai Ioniq 6. And I cross-tested them. They're both great cars. It comes down to the charging network, and Tesla won conclusively on that. But if you're not going to take your Ioniq 6 on long-distance trips, it's fine. It's a little bit smoother and more comfortable than the Model 3, which is sort of the BMW to the Ioniq's something else.
Pickup truck.
F-150, no question. F-150 Lightning. I remain shocked and awed how good a job Ford did in threading the needle between making something that doesn't look like a science project. It looks like an F-150 pickup truck, and giving it decent range and cool features like the front trunk. I think they call it a power mega frunk, where two of my friends are like, "Oh, you mean the thing that has the beer cooler in it?"
Right. Right.
So it's really good. I like the Rivian R1T. Too small.
I was going to ask you about Rivian.
Yeah, it's an intermediate sized truck. It's the size of a Frontier. Very nice truck. Elegant in a lot of ways that the Ford deliberately isn't. But if I'm going to buy a pickup truck, I'm probably going to want a full-size pickup truck.
I thought you were going to say
just will they make more body styles? But
I thought you were going to say the Tesla Cybertruck.
Oh, what's that? I have been swamped in Cybertruck propaganda on both sides. And unless or until multiple members of the automotive press actually get to drive them, I'm reserving all my opinions.
There we go. Well, you could talk about the exterior, what you think of it.
There is clearly a market for people who want to drive a dystopian movie prop.
Right.
I don't know how large that market is. I actually looked up Hummer H2 sales data. And in its best year in the US, the H2 sold 38,000 copies, and then it trailed off from there.
Right.
At that point, I think the H2 in the sort of mid 2000s was the most aggressive, in your face, up yours, get out of my way vehicle you could buy. And I think the Cybertruck probably fits as much into that niche as everything else. It appears to have some very interesting technology. Tesla is going to have a hell of a time ramping volume because of some of that technology. It's interesting. I would really like to drive one, but since Tesla may still send poop emojis to people from the press who inquire, I will not likely inquire.
And finally, large SUV.
Large SUV. I've only driven it on a proving ground. Again, the Kia EV9 is remarkably impressive in the sort of mid-high priced category. It's certainly not luxury pricing. I saw the Lucid Gravity this week, actually, which is really very impressive, although it will be, most of them will sell for six figures. But it's extremely well done, very good packaging efficiency. Lucid is known for its efficient and small powertrains. So that one for sort of the higher end, and I can't really speak, I've seen the electric Escalade, but I can't really speak to anything more about that. And GM is a whole side issue about their challenges getting EVs into production at this moment.
John, what an education, what a thrill, and what a pleasure. Thank you.
No, you're very kind. We still have 212 slides to go.
Well, the flight's over, John.
Exactly. All right. Thanks for having me. This is fun. And
thank you for being on the program and for educating our listeners today.
My pleasure. Take care.
We'll have you back when there are 100 more vehicles out on the lots.
A couple years from now.
Right. Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Thanks again to my guest today, EV expert and car and driver author, John Voelcker. And to see my interview with John, go to the Cars and Culture YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to see more than 135 interviews and more than 1,000 videos. I'm Jason Stein, your host of Cars and Culture. We'll see you down the road.